How do you? And we're live. Good afternoon, people of Earth, or any of the other multi-dimensional places that you may be inhabiting. Greetings, salutations. Today, I will be starting At the Earth's Core by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Had to do some digging through what I can read. Out of the stuff that I have. So, decided on this one today. Thought, what the hell, I've never read anything by Mr. Burroughs. He's the author of such things as Tarzan and John Carter of Mars. For any of you that know those series by him, he also did like a Moon series as well. He was a pretty prolific writer in the early 1900s. Oh shit! If I'd have grabbed my Who's It, I'd be all ready to go. So yeah, I decided I'd check out this today and try out one of his books. I don't know how far I'll get in this first session. Try to go as far as I can. But we shall see. Currently, I picked up a Neil Gaiman novel that I'm reading myself. Really enjoying that. Always good for one of those before I start. Yeah. So feel free to comment, chat if you're on YouTube. Whoa, that was a good one. Stand by. Whew. Give myself a second after that. But yeah, I wanted to read the John Carter of Mars series a while ago. And in fact, I picked it up. Excuse me. A hardcover version. I've since sold it because I now have it on my Kindle. I picked it up for like 99 cents, all of them. More than what I had. So, blow my nose here real quick and then it's done. I'm talking lovely shit. Sorry. Let us begin. At the Earth's Core by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Prologue. In the first place, bear in mind that I do not expect you to believe this story. Nor could you wonder had you witnessed a recent experience of mine when, in the armor of blissful and stupendous ignorance, I gaily narrated the gist of it to a fellow of the Royal Geological Society on the occasion of my last trip to London. You would surely thought that I had been detected in no less a heinous crime than the purloining of the crown jewels from the tower or putting poison in the coffee of His Majesty the King. The erudite gentleman in whom I confided congealed before I was half through. It is all that saved him from exploding, and my dreams of an honorary fellowship, gold medals, and a niche in the Hall of Fame faded into the thin, cold air of his Arctic atmosphere. But I believed the story, and so would you, and so would the learned fellow of the Royal Geological Society, had you and he heard it from the lips of the man who told it to me. Had you seen, as I did, the fire of truth in those gray eyes. Had you felt the ring of sincerity in that quiet voice. Had you realized the pathos of it all. You too would believe. You would not have needed the final ocular proof that I had. The weird, Rhamphorhynchus-like creature which he had brought back with him from the inner world. I came upon him quite suddenly, and no less unexpectedly, upon the rim of the great Sahara Desert. He was standing before a goatskin tent amidst a clump of date palms within a tiny oasis. Close by was an Arab douar of some 8 or 10 tents. I had come down from the north to hunt lion. My party consisted of a dozen children of the desert. I was the only white man. As we approached the little clump of verdure, I saw the man come from his tent, and with hand-shaded eyes peer intently at us. At sight of me, he advanced rapidly to meet us. "A white man," he cried. "May the good Lord be praised. I have been watching you for hours, hoping against hope that this time there would be a white man. Tell me the date. What year is it?" And when I told him, he staggered as though he had been struck full in the face, so that he was compelled to grasp my stirrup leather for support. "It cannot be," he cried after a moment. "It cannot be. Tell me that you are mistaken, or that you are but joking." "I am telling you the truth, my friend," I replied. "Why should I deceive a stranger or attempt to, in so simple a matter as the date?" For some time he stood in silence with bowed head. 10 years, he murmured at last. 10 years. And I thought that at the most it could be scarce more than one. That night he told me his story, the story that I give you here as nearly in his own words as I can recall them. Chapter 1. Toward the Eternal Fires. I was born in Connecticut about 30 years ago. My name is David Innes. My father was a wealthy mine owner. When I was 19, he died. All his property was to be mine when I had attained my majority, provided that I had devoted the 2 years intervening in close application to the great business I was to inherit. I did my best to fulfill the last wishes of my parent, not because of the inheritance, but because I loved and honored my father. For 6 months, I toiled in the mines and in the counting rooms, for which I wished to know every minute detail of the business. Then Perry interested me in his invention. He was an old fellow who had devoted the better part of a long life to the perfection of a mechanical subterranean prospector. As relaxation, he studied paleontology. I looked over his plans, listened to his arguments, inspected his working model, and then, convinced I had advanced the funds necessary to construct a full-size, practical prospector. I shall not go into details of its construction. It lies out there in the desert now, about 2 miles from here. Tomorrow you may care to ride out and see it. Roughly, it is a steel cylinder 100 feet long, and jointed so that it may turn and twist through solid rock if need be. At one end is a mighty revolving drill operated by an engine which Perry said generated more power to the cubic inch than any other engine did to the cubic foot. I remember that he used to claim that the invention alone would make us fabulously wealthy. We were going to make the whole thing public after the successful issue of our first secret trial. But Perry never returned from that trial trip, and I only after 10 years. I recall, as it were, but yesterday, the night of that momentous occasion upon which we were to test the practicality of that wondrous invention. It was near midnight when we repaired to the lofty tower in which Perry had constructed his iron mole, as he was wont to call the thing. The great nose rested upon the bare earth of the floor. We passed through the doors into the outer jacket, secured them, and then passing on into the cabin, which contained the controlling mechanism within the inner tube, switched on the electric lights. Perry looked to his generator, to the great tanks that held the life-giving chemicals with which he was to manufacture fresh air to replace that which we consumed in breathing, to help his instruments for recording temperatures, speed, distance, and for examining the materials through which we were to pass. He tested the steering device and overlooked the mighty cogs which transmitted its marvelous velocity to the giant drill at the nose of his strange craft. Our seats into which we strapped ourselves were so arranged upon transverse bars that we would be upright whether the craft were plowing her way downward into the bowels of the earth, or running horizontally along some great seam of coal, or rising vertically toward the surface again. At length all was ready. Perry bowed his head in prayer. For a moment we were silent, and then the old man's hand grasped the starting lever. There was a frightful roaring beneath us. The giant frame trembled and vibrated. There was a rush of sound as the loose earth passed up through the hollow space between the inner and outer jackets to be deposited in our wake. We were off. The noise was deafening. The sensation was frightful. For a full minute neither of us could be aught but to cling with the proverbial desperation of the drowning man to the handrails of our swinging seats. Then Perry glanced at the thermometer. "Gad," he cried, "it cannot be possible. Quick! What does the distance meter read?" That and the speedometer were both on my side of the cabin, and as I turned to take a reading from the former, I could see Perry muttering, 10 degrees rise, it cannot be possible. And then I saw him tug frantically upon the steering wheel. As I finally found the tiny needle in the dim light, I translated Perry's evident excitement, and my heart sank within me. But when I spoke, I hid the fear which haunted me. "It will be 700 feet, Perry," I said, "by the time you can turn her into the horizontal." "You'd better lend me a hand then, my boy," he replied, "for I cannot budge her out of the vertical alone. God give that our combined strength may be equal to the task, for else we are lost." I wormed my way to the old man's side with never a doubt but that the great wheel would yield on the instant to the power of my young and vigorous muscles. Nor was my belief mere vanity, for always had my physique been the envy and despair of my fellows, and for that very reason it had waxed even greater than nature had intended, since my natural pride and my great strength had led me to care for and develop my body and my muscles by every means within my power. What with boxing, football, and baseball, I had been in training since childhood. And so it was with the utmost confidence that I laid hold of the huge iron rim. But though I threw every ounce of my strength into it, my best effort was as unavailing as Perry's had been. The thing would not budge. The grim, insensate, horrible thing that was holding us upon the straight road to death. At length I gave up the useless struggle, and without a word returned to my seat. There was no need for words, at least none that I could imagine, unless Perry desired to pray, and I was never quite sure that he would, for he never left an opportunity neglected where he might sandwich in a prayer. He prayed when he arose in the morning, he prayed before he ate, he prayed when he had finished eating, and before he went to bed at night he prayed again. In between, he often found excuses to pray, even when the provocation seemed far-fetched to my worldly eyes. Now that he was about to die, I felt positive that I should witness a perfect orgy of prayer, if one may allude with such a simile to so solemn an act. But to my astonishment, I discovered that with death staring him in the face, Abner Perry was transformed into a new being. From his lips there flowed not prayer, but a clear and limpid stream of undiluted profanity, and it was all directed at that quietly stubborn piece of unyielding mechanism. "I should think, Perry," I chided, "that a man of your professed religiousness would rather be at his prayers than cursing in the presence of imminent death." "Death?" he cried. "Death is it that appalls you? That is nothing by comparison with the loss the world must suffer. Why, David, within this iron cylinder we have demonstrated possibilities that science has scarce dreamed. We have harnessed a new principle, and with it animated a piece of steel with the power of 10,000 men. That 2 lives will be snuffed out is nothing to the world calamity that entombs in the bowels of the earth the discoveries that I have made and proved in the successful construction of the thing that is now carrying us farther and farther toward the eternal central fires. I am frank to admit that for myself, I was much more concerned with our own immediate future than with any problematic loss which the world might be about to suffer. The world was at least ignorant of its bereavement, while to me it was a real and terrible actuality. What can we do? I asked, hiding my perturbation beneath the mask of a low and level voice. We may stop here and die of asphyxiation when our atmosphere tanks are empty, replied Perry. Or we may continue on with the slight hope that we may later sufficiently deflect the prospector from the vertical to carry us along the arc of a great circle which must eventually return us to the surface. If we succeed in so doing before we reach the higher internal temperature, we may yet even survive. There would seem to me to be about 1 chance in several million that we shall succeed. Otherwise, we shall die more quickly, but no more surely than as though we sat supinely waiting for the torture of a slow and horrible death. I glanced at the thermometer. It registered 110 degrees. While we were talking, the mighty iron mole had bored its way over a mile into the rock of the Earth's crust. Let us continue on then, I replied. It should be soon over at this rate. You never intimated that the speed of this thing would be so high, Perry. Didn't you know it? No, he answered. I could not figure the speed exactly, for I had no instrument to measuring the mighty power of my generator. I reasoned, however, that we should make about 500 yards an hour. And we are making 7 miles an hour, I concluded for him, as I sat with my eyes upon the distance meter. How thick is the Earth's crust, Perry? I asked. There are almost as many conjectures as to that as there are geologists, was his answer. One estimates it's 30 miles because the internal heat, increasing at the rate of about 1 degree to each 60 to 70 feet depth, would be sufficient to fuse the most refractory substances at that distance between the surface. Another finds that the phenomena of precession and nutation require that the Earth, if not entirely solid, must at least have a shell not less than 800 to 1,000 miles in thickness. So there you are, you may take your choice. And if it should prove solid? I asked. It will be all the same to us in the end, David, replied Perry. At the best, our fuel will suffice to carry us but 3 or 4 days, while our atmosphere cannot last to exceed 3. Neither, then, is sufficient to bear us in the safety through 8,000 miles of rock to the antipodes. If the crust is of sufficient thickness, we shall come to a final stop between 600 and 700 miles beneath the Earth's surface. But during the last 150 miles of our journey, we shall be corpses. Am I correct? I asked. Quite correct, David. Are you frightened? I do not know. It all has come so suddenly that I scarce believe that either of us realizes the real terrors of our position. I feel that I should be reduced to panic, but yet I am not. I imagine that the shock has been so great as to partially stun our sensibilities. Again, I turned to the thermometer. The mercury was rising with less rapidity. It was now but 140 degrees, although we had penetrated to a depth of nearly 4 miles. I told Perry, and he smiled. We have shattered one theory, at least, was his only comment, and then he returned to his self-assumed occupation of fluently cursing the steering wheel. I once heard a pirate swear, but his best efforts would have seemed like those of a tyro alongside Perry's masterful and scientific imprecations. Once more I tried my hand at the wheel, but I might as well have essayed to swing the Earth itself. At my suggestion, Perry stopped the generator, and as we came to rest, I again threw all my strength into a supreme effort to move the thing even a hair's breadth. But the results were as barren as when we had been traveling at top speed. I shook my head sadly and motioned to the starting lever. Perry pulled it toward him, and once again we were plunging downward toward eternity at the rate of 7 miles an hour. I sat with my eyes glued to the thermometer and the distance meter. The mercury was rising very slowly now, though even at 145 degrees it was almost unbearable within the narrow confines of our metal prison. About noon, or 12 hours after our start upon this unfortunate journey, we had bored to a depth of 84 miles, at which point the mercury registered 153 degrees Fahrenheit. Perry was becoming more hopeful, although upon what meager food he sustained his optimism I could not conjecture. From the cursing he had turned to singing. I felt that the strain had at last affected his mind. For several hours we had not spoken except as he asked me for the readings of the instruments from time to time, and I announced them. My thoughts were filled with vain regrets. I recalled numerous acts of my past life which I should have been glad to have a few more years to live down. There was the affair in the Latin Commons at Andover when Calhoun and I had put gunpowder in the stove and nearly killed one of the masters. And then, but what was the use? I was about to die and atone for all these things and several more. Already the heat was sufficient to give me a foretaste of the hereafter. A few more degrees and I felt that I should lose consciousness. What are the readings now, David? Perry's voice broke in upon my somber reflections. 99 miles and 153 degrees, I replied. Gad, but we've knocked the 30-mile crust theory into a cocked hat, he cried gleefully. Precious lot of good it will do us, I growled back. But my boy, he continued, doesn't that temperature reading mean anything to you? Why, it hasn't gone up in 6 miles. Think of it, son. Yes, I'm thinking of it, I answered. But what difference will it make when our air supply is exhausted, whether the temperature is 153 degrees or 153,000? We'll be just as dead, and no one will know the difference anyhow. But I must admit, for some unaccountable reason, the stationary temperature did renew my waning hope. What I hoped for I could not have explained, nor did I try. The very fact, as Perry took pains to explain, of the blasting of several very exact and learned scientific hypotheses made it apparent that we could not know what lay before us within the bowels of the earth, and so we might continue to hope for the best, at least until we were dead, when hope would no longer be essential to our happiness. It was very good and logical reasoning, and so I embraced it. At 100 miles, the temperature had dropped to 152.5 degrees. When I announced it, Perry reached over and hugged me. From then on until noon of the second day, it continued to drop until it became as uncomfortably cold as it had been unbearably hot before. At the depth of 240 miles, our nostrils were assailed by almost overpowering ammonia fumes, and the temperature had dropped to 10 below zero. We suffered nearly 2 hours of this intense and bitter cold, until at about 245 miles from the surface of the earth, we entered a stratum of solid ice when the mercury quickly rose to 32 degrees. During the next 3 hours, we passed through 10 miles of ice, eventually emerging into another series of ammonia-impregnated strata, where the mercury again fell to 10 degrees below zero. Slowly it rose once more until we were convinced that at last we were nearing the molten interior of the earth. At 400 miles, the temperature had reached 153 degrees. Feverishly, I watched the thermometer. Slowly it rose. Perry had ceased singing and was at last praying. Our hopes had received such a death blow that gradually increasing heat seemed to our distorted imaginations much greater than it really was. For another hour, I saw the pitiless column of mercury rise and rise until at 410 miles it stood at 153 degrees. Now it was that we began to hang upon those readings in almost breathless anxiety. 153 degrees had been the maximum temperature above the ice stratum. Would it stop at this point again, or would it continue its merciless climb? We knew that there was no hope, and yet with persistence of life itself, we continued to hope against practical certainty. Already the air tanks were at low ebb. There was barely enough of the precious gases to sustain us for another 12 hours. But would we be alive to know or care? It seemed incredible. At 420 miles, I took another reading. Perry, I shouted. Perry, man, she's going down, she's going down. She's 152 degrees again. Gad, he cried. What can it mean? Can the earth be cold at the center? I do not know, Perry, I answered. But thank God, if I am to die, it shall not be by fire. That is all I have feared. I can face the thought of any death but that. Down, down went the mercury until it stood as low as it had 7 miles from the surface of the earth. And then, of a sudden, the realization broke upon us that death was very near. Perry was the first to discover it. I saw him fussing with the valves that regulate the air supply. And at the same time, I experienced difficulty in breathing. My head felt dizzy, my limbs heavy. I saw Perry crumple in his seat. He gave himself a shake and sat erect again. Then he turned toward me. "Goodbye, David," he said. "I guess this is the end." And then he smiled and closed his eyes. "Goodbye, Perry, and good luck to you," I answered, smiling back at him. But I fought off that awful lethargy. I was very young. I did not want to die. For an hour, I battled against the cruelly enveloping death that surrounded me upon all sides. At first, I found that by climbing high into the framework above me, I could find more of the precious life-giving elements, and for a while these sustained me. It must have been an hour after Perry had succumbed that I at last came to the realization that I could no longer carry on this unequal struggle against the inevitable. With my last flickering ray of consciousness, I turned mechanically toward the distance meter. It stood at exactly 500 miles from the Earth's surface. And then of a sudden, the huge thing that bore us came to a stop. The rattle of hurtling rock through the hollow jacket ceased. The wild racing of the giant drill betokened that it was running loose in air. And then another truth flashed upon me. The point of the prospector was above us. Slowly it dawned on me that since passing through the ice strata, it had been above. We had turned in the ice and sped upward towards the Earth's crust. Thank God we were safe. I put my nose to the intake pipe through which samples were to have been taken during the passage of the prospector through the Earth, and my fondest hopes were realized. A flood of fresh air was pouring into the iron cabin. The reaction left me in a state of collapse, and I lost consciousness. It's the end of chapter 1. Grab a drink here. All right. Chapter 2, A Strange World. I was unconscious little more than an instant, for as I lunged forward from the crossbeam to which I had been clinging and fell with a crash to the floor of the cabin, the shock brought me to myself. My first concern was with Perry. I was horrified at the thought that upon the very threshold of salvation he might be dead. Tearing open his shirt, I placed my ear to his breast. I could have cried with relief. His heart was beating quite regularly. At the water tank, I wetted my handkerchief, slapping it smartly across his forehead and face several times. In a moment, I was rewarded by the raising of his lids. For a time, he lay wide-eyed and quite uncomprehending. Then his scattered wits slowly foregathered, and he sat up sniffing the air with an expression of wonderment upon his face. "Why, David," he cried at last, "it's air, as sure as I live. Why, what does it mean? Where in the world are we? What has happened?" "It means that we're back at the surface all right, Perry," I cried. "But where, I don't know. I haven't opened her up yet. Been too busy reviving you. Lord, man, but you had a close squeak." "You say we're back at the surface? David, how can that be? How long have I been unconscious?" "Not long. We turned in the ice stratum. Don't you recall the sudden whirling of our seats? After the drill was above you instead of below? We didn't notice it at the time, but I recall it now." "You mean to say that we turned back in the ice stratum, David? That is not possible. The prospector cannot turn unless its nose is deflected from the outside by some external force or resistance. The steering wheel within would have moved in response. The steering wheel has not budged, David, since we started. You know that." I did know it, but here we were with our drill racing in pure air, and copious volumes of it pouring into the cabin. We couldn't have turned in the ice stratum, Perry. I know as well as you," I replied. "But the fact remains that we did, for here we are this minute at the surface of the Earth again, and I am going out to see just where." "Better wait till morning, David. It must be midnight now." I glanced at the chronometer. Half after 12. We've been out 72 hours, so it must be midnight. Nevertheless, I'm going to have a look at the blessed sky that I have given up all hope of ever seeing again. And so saying, I lifted the bars from the inner door and swung it open. There was quite a quantity of loose material in the jacket, and this I had to remove with a shovel to get at the opposite door and the outer shell. In a short time, I had removed enough of the earth and rock to the floor of the cabin to expose the door beyond. Perry was directly behind me as I threw it open. The upper half was above the surface of the ground. With an expression of surprise, I turned and looked at Perry. It was broad daylight without. Something seems to have gone wrong in either with our calculations or the chronometer, I said. Perry shook his head. There was a strange expression in his eyes. Let's have a look beyond that door, David, he cried. Together we stepped out to stand in silent contemplation of a landscape at once weird and beautiful. Before us, a low and level shore stretched down to a silent sea. As far as the eye could reach, the surface of the water was dotted with countless tiny isles, some of towering, barren granite rock, others resplendent in gorgeous trappings of tropical vegetation. Myriads starred with the magnificent splendor of vivid blooms. Behind us rose a dark and forbidding wood of giant arborescent ferns, intermingled with the commoner types of primeval tropical forest. Huge creepers depended in great loops from tree to tree. Dense underbrush overgrew a tangled mass of fallen trunks and branches. Upon the outer verge, we could see the same splendid coloring of countless blossoms that glorified the islands. But within the dense shadows, all seemed dark and gloomy as the grave. And upon all the noonday sun poured its torrid rays out of a cloudless sky. Where on earth can we be? I asked, turning to Perry. For some moments the old man did not reply. He stood with bowed head, buried in deep thought, but at last he spoke. David, he said, I am not so sure that we are on Earth. What do you mean, Perry? I cried. Do you think we are dead, and this is heaven? He smiled, and turning, pointed to the nose of the prospector protruding from the ground at our backs. But for that, David, I might believe that we were indeed come to the country beyond the sticks. The prospector renders the theory untenable. It certainly could never have gone to heaven. However, I am willing to concede that we actually may be in another world from that which we have always known. If we are not on Earth, there is every reason to believe that we may be in it. We may have quartered through the Earth's crust and come out upon some tropical island of the West Indies, I suggested. Again, Perry shook his head. Let us wait and see, David, he replied. And in the meantime, suppose we do a bit of exploring up and down the coast. We may find a native who can enlighten us. As we walked along the beach, Perry gazed long and earnestly across the water. Evidently, he was wrestling with a mighty problem. David, he said abruptly, do you perceive anything unusual about the horizon? As I looked, I began to appreciate the reason for the strangeness of the landscape that had haunted me from the first, with an elusive suggestion of the bizarre and unnatural. There was no horizon. As far as the eye could reach out, the sea continued, and upon its bosom floated tiny islands, those in the distance reduced to mere specks, but ever beyond them was the sea, until the impression became quite real that one was looking up at the most distant point the eyes could fathom. The distance was lost in the distance. That was all. There was no clear-cut horizontal line marking the dip of the globe below the line of vision. A great light is commencing to break on me, continued Perry, taking out his watch. I believe that I have partially solved the riddle. It is now 2 o'clock. When we emerged from the prospector, the sun was directly above us. Where is it now? I glanced up to find the Great Orb still motionless in the center of the heaven, and such a sun. I had scarcely noticed it before. Fully thrice the size of the sun I had known throughout my life, and apparently so near that the sight of it carried the conviction that one might almost reach up and touch it. My God, Perry, where are we? I exclaimed. This thing is beginning to get on my nerves. I think that I may state quite positively, David, he commenced, that we are, but he got no further. From behind us in the vicinity of the prospector, there came the most thunderous, awe-inspiring roar that ever had fallen upon my ears. With one accord, we turned to discover the author of that fearsome noise. Had I still retained the suspicion that we were on Earth, the sight that met my eyes would quite entirely have banished it. Emerging from the forest was a colossal beast which closely resembled a bear. It was fully as large as the largest elephant, and with great forepaws armed with huge claws. Its nose or snout depended nearly a foot below its lower jaw, much after the manner of a rudimentary trunk. The giant body was covered with a coat of thick, shaggy hair. Roaring horribly, it came toward us at a ponderous, shuffling trot. I turned to Perry to suggest that it might be wise to seek other surroundings. The idea had evidently occurred to Perry previously, for he was already 100 paces away, and with each second his prodigious bounds increased the distance. I had never guessed what latent speed possibilities the old gentleman possessed. I saw that he was headed toward a little point of the forest which ran out toward the sea not far from where we'd been standing, and as the mighty creature, the sight of which had galvanized him into such remarkable action, was forging steadily toward me, I set off after Perry, though at a somewhat more decorous pace. It was evident that the massive beast pursuing us was not built for speed, so all that I considered necessary was to gain the trees sufficiently ahead of it to enable me to climb to the safety of some great branch before it came up. Notwithstanding our danger, I could not help but laugh at Perry's frantic capers as he essayed to gain the safety of the lower branches of the trees he had now reached. The stems were bare for a distance of some 15 feet, at least on those trees which Perry attempted to ascend, for the suggestion of safety carried by the larger of the forest giants had evidently attracted him to them. A dozen times he scrambled up the trunks like a huge cat, only to fall back to the ground once more, and with each failure he cast a horrified glance over his shoulder at the oncoming brute, simultaneously emitting terror-stricken shrieks that awoke the echoes of the grim forest. At length he spied a dangling creeper about the bigness of one's wrist, and when I reached the trees, he was racing madly up it, hand over hand. He had almost reached the lowest branch of the tree from which the creeper depended, when the thing parted beneath his weight, and he fell sprawling at my feet. The misfortune now was no longer amusing, for the beast was already too close to us for comfort. Seizing Perry by the shoulder, I dragged him to his feet, and rushing to a smaller tree, one that he could easily encircle with his arms and legs, I boosted him as far up as I could, and then left him to his fate, for a glance over my shoulder revealed the awful beast almost upon me. It was the great size of the thing alone that saved me. Its enormous bulk rendered it too slow upon its feet to cope with the agility of my young muscles, and so I was enabled to dodge out of its way and run completely behind it before its slow wits could direct it in pursuit. The few seconds of grace that this gave me found me safely lodged in the branches of a tree a few paces from that in which Perry had at last found a haven. Did I say safely lodged? At the time I thought we were quite safe, and so did Perry. He was praying, raising his voice in thanksgiving at our deliverance, and had just completed a sort of paean gratitude that the thing couldn't climb a tree, when without warning it reared up beneath him on its enormous tail and hind feet, and reached those fearfully armed paws quite to the branch upon which he crouched. The accompanying roar was all but drowned in Perry's scream of fright, and he came near tumbling headlong into the gaping jaws beneath him. So precipitate was his impetuous haste to vacate the dangerous limb. It was with a deep sigh of relief that I saw him gain a higher branch in safety. And then the brute did that which froze us both anew with horror. Grasping the tree's stem with his powerful paws, he dragged down with all the great weight of his huge bulk and all the irresistible force of those mighty muscles. Slowly but surely the stem began to bend toward him. Inch by inch he worked his paws upward as the tree leaned more and more from the perpendicular. Perry clung chattering in a panic of terror. Higher and higher into the bending and swaying tree he clambered. More and more rapidly was the treetop inclining toward the ground. I saw now why the great brute was armed with such enormous paws. The use that he was putting them was precisely that for which the nature had intended them. The sloth-like creature was The sloth-like creature was herbivorous, and to feed that mighty carcass, entire trees must be stripped of their foliage. The reason for its attacking us might easily be accounted for on the suspicion of an ugly disposition, such as that which the fierce and stupid rhinoceros of Africa possesses. But these were later reflections. At the moment, I was too frantic with apprehension on Perry's behalf to consider aught other than a means to save him from the death that loomed so close. Realizing that I could outdistance the clumsy brute in the open, I dropped from my leafy sanctuary, intent only on distracting the thing's attention from Perry long enough to enable the old man to gain the safety of a larger tree. There were so many close by, which not even the terrific strength of that titanic monster could bend. As I touched the ground, I snatched a broken limb from the tangled mass that matted the jungle-like floor of the forest, and leaping unnoticed behind the shaggy back, dealt the brute a terrific blow. My plan worked like magic. From the previous slowness of the beast, I had been led to look for no such marvelous agility as he now displayed. Releasing his hold upon the tree, dropped on all fours, and at the same time swung his great, wicked tail with a force that would have broken every bone in my body had it struck me. But fortunately, I had turned to flee at the very instant that I felt my blow land upon the towering back. As it started in pursuit of me, I made the mistake of running along the edge of the forest rather than making for the open beach. In a moment, I was knee-deep in rotting vegetation, and the awful thing behind me was gaining rapidly as I floundered and fell in my efforts to extricate myself. A fallen log gave me an instant's advantage. For climbing upon it, I leaped to another a few paces farther on, and in this way was able to keep clear of the mush that carpeted the surrounding ground. But the zigzag course of this that this necessitated was placing such a heavy handicap upon me that my pursuer was steadily gaining upon me. Suddenly from behind I heard a tumult of howls and sharp, piercing barks, much the sound that of a pack of wolves raises when in full cry. Involuntarily I glanced backward to discover the origin of this new and menacing note, with the result that I missed my footing and went sprawling once more upon my face in the deep muck. My mammoth enemy was so close by this time that I knew I must feel the weight of one of his terrible paws before I could rise, but to my surprise the blow did not fall upon me. The howling and snapping and barking of the new element which had been infused into the melee now seemed centered quite close behind me, and as I raised myself upon my hands and glanced around, I saw what it was that had distracted the Dirith, as I afterward learned the thing is called, from my trail. I was surrounded by a pack of some 100 wolf-like creatures, wild dogs they seemed, that rushed, growling and snapping, in upon it from all sides, so that they sank their white fangs into the slow brute, and were away again before it could reach them with its huge paws or sweeping tail. But these were not all that my startled eyes perceived. Chattering and gibbering through the lower branches of the trees came a company of man-like creatures, evidently urging on the dog pack. They were all appearances strikingly similar in aspect to the Negro of Africa. Their skins were very black, and their features much like those of the more pronounced Negroid type, except that the head receded more rapidly above the eyes, leaving little or no forehead. Their arms were rather longer and their legs shorter in proportion to the torso than in man, and later I noticed that their great toes protruded at right angles from their feet because of their arboreal habits, I presume. Behind them trailed long, slender tails, which they used in climbing quite as much as they did either their hands or feet. I had stumbled to my feet the moment that I discovered that the wolf dogs were holding the Dirith at bay. At sight of me, several of the savage creatures left off worrying the great brute to come slinking with bared fangs toward me, and as I turned to run toward the trees again to seek safety among the lower branches, I saw a number of the man-apes leaping and chattering in the foliage of the nearest tree. Between them and the beast behind me there was little choice, but at least there was a doubt as to the reception these grotesque parodies on humanity would accord me, while there was none as to the fate which awaited me beneath the grinning fangs of my fierce pursuers. And so I raced on toward the trees, intending to pass beneath that which held the man-things, and take refuge in another farther on. But the wolf dogs were very close behind me, so close that I had despaired of escaping them, when one of the creatures in the tree above swung down head foremost, his tail looped about a great limb, and grasping me beneath my armpits, swung me in safety up among his fellows. There they fell to examining me with the utmost excitement and curiosity. They picked at my clothing, my hair, and my flesh. They turned me about to see if I had a tail, and when they discovered that I was not so equipped, they fell into roars of laughter. Their teeth were very large and white and even except for the upper canines, which were a trifle longer than the others, protruding just a bit when the mouth was closed. When they had examined me for a few moments, one of them discovered that my clothing was not a part of me, with the result that the garment by garment they tore it from me amidst peals of the wildest laughter. Ape-like, they essayed to don the apparel themselves, but their ingenuity was not sufficient to the task, and so they gave it up. In the meantime, I had been straining my eyes to catch a glimpse of Perry, but nowhere about could I see him, although the clump of trees in which he had first taken refuge was in full view. I was much exercised by fear that something had befallen him, and though I called his name aloud several times, there was no response. Tired at last of playing with my clothing, the creatures threw it to the ground, and catching me one on either side by an arm, started off at the most terrifying pace through the treetops. Never have I experienced such a journey before or since. Even now I oftentimes awake from a deep sleep haunted by the horrid remembrance of that awful experience. From tree to tree the agile creatures sprang like flying squirrels, while the cold sweat stood upon my brow as I glimpsed the depths beneath into which a single misstep on the part of either of my bearers would hurl me. As they bore me along, my mind was occupied with 1,000 bewildering thoughts. What had become of Perry? Would I ever see him again? What were the intentions of these half-human things into whose hands I had fallen? Were they inhabitants of the same world into which I had been born? No, it could not be. But yet, where else? I had not left that earth, of that I was sure. Still, neither could I reconcile the things which I had seen to a belief that I was still in the world of my birth. With a sigh, I gave it up. That's the end of chapter 2. Restart the bonfire here. It's an interesting book so far. Take a little short break here. Those of you that are listening, again. Like I said, I've never read one of Mr. Burroughs' books before. So this is fresh territory for me. What the hell? Let's check it out. Let's check it out today. What the hell else do I have going on? Hopefully the bird isn't too loud. I've listened to some of the other streams, and I don't think he has been, but no one's complaining. A lot of times I take him right out of the room, but generally I just leave them in. It adds to the ambiance. Because you often hear a parakeet at a fucking bonfire. Right? Okay, let's start this again. Chapter 3. A Change of Masters. Anyway. We must have traveled several miles through the dark and dismal wood when we came suddenly upon a dense village built high among the branches of the trees. As we approached it, my escort broke into wild shouting, which was immediately answered from within. And a moment later, a swarm of creatures of the same strange race as those who had captured me poured out to meet us. Again, I was the center of a wildly chattering horde. I was pulled this way and that, pinched, pounded, and thumped until I was black and blue. Yet I do not think that their treatment was dictated by either cruelty or malice. I was a curiosity, a freak, a new plaything, and their childish minds required added evidence of all their senses to back up the testimony of their eyes. Presently, they dragged me within the village, which consisted of several hundred rude shelters of boughs and leaves supported upon the branches of the trees. Sorry. Between the huts, which sometimes formed crooked streets, were dead branches and the trunks of small trees which connected the huts upon one tree to those within adjoining trees. The whole network of huts and pathways, forming an almost solid flooring a good 50 feet above the ground. I wondered why these agile creatures required connecting bridges between the trees, but later when I saw the motley aggregation of half-savage beasts, which they kept within their village, I realized the necessity for the pathways. There were a number of the same vicious wolfdogs which we had left worrying the deereth, and many goat-like animals whose distended udders explained the reason for their presence. My guards halted before one of the huts into which I was pushed. Then 2 of the creatures squatted down before the entrance to prevent my escape, doubtless. Though where I should have escaped to, I certainly had not the remotest conception. I had no more than entered the dark shadows of the interior than there fell upon my ears the tones of a familiar voice in prayer. "Perry," I cried. "Dear old Perry, thank Lord you are safe." "David, can it be possible that you had escaped?" The old man stumbled toward me and threw his arms about me. He had seen me fall before the deereth, and then he had been seized by a number of the ape creatures and borne through the treetops to their village. His captors had been inquisitive as to his strange clothing as had mine, with the same result. As we looked at each other, we could not help but laugh. "With a tail, David," remarked Perry. "You would make a very handsome ape." "Maybe we can borrow a couple," I rejoined. "They seem to be quite the thing this season. I wonder what the creatures intend doing with us, Perry. They don't seem really savage. What do you suppose they can be? You were about to tell me where we are when the great hairy frigate bore down upon us. Have you really any idea at all?" "Yes, David," he replied. "I know precisely where we are. We have made a magnificent discovery, my boy. We have proved that the earth is hollow. We have passed entirely through its crust to the inner world." "Perry, you're mad." "Not at all, David. For 250 miles, our prospector bore us through the crust beneath our outer world. At that point, it reached the center of gravity of the 500-mile thick crust. Up to that point, we had been descending. Direction is, of course, merely relative. Then at the moment that our seats revolved, the thing that made you believe that we had turned about and were speeding upward, we passed the center of gravity, and though we did not alter the direction of our progress, yet we were in reality moving upward toward the surface of the inner world. Does not the strange fauna and flora which we have seen convince you that you are not in the world of your birth? And the horizon, could it present the strange aspects which we both noted unless we were indeed standing upon the inside surface of a sphere?" "But the sun, Perry," I urged. "How in the world can the sun shine through 500 miles of solid crust?" "It is not the sun of the outer world that we see here. It is another sun, an entirely different sun. that casts its eternal noonday effulgence upon the face of the inner world. Look at it now, David. If you can see it from the doorway of this hut, and you will see that it is still there in the exact center of the heavens. You have been here for many hours, yet it is still noon. And withal, it is very simple, David. The earth was once a nebulous mass. It cooled, and as it cooled, it shrank. At length, a thin crust of solid matter formed upon its outer surface, a sort of shell. But within, it was partially molten matter and highly expanded gases. As it continued to cool, what happened? Centrifugal force hurled the particles of the nebulous center toward the crust as rapidly as they approached a solid state. You have seen the same principle practically applied in the modern cream separator. Presently, there was only a small superheated core of gaseous matter remaining within a huge vacant interior left by the contraction of the cooling gases. The equal attraction of the solid crust from all directions maintained this luminous core in the exact center of the hollow globe. What remains of it is the sun you saw today, a relatively tiny thing at the exact center of the earth. Equally to every part of this inner world, it diffuses its perpetual noonday light and torrid heat. This inner world must have cooled sufficiently to support animal life long ages after life appeared upon the outer crust. But that the same agencies were at work here is evident from the similar forms of both animal and vegetable creation, which we have already seen. Take the great beast which attacked us, for example. Unquestionably a counterpart of the megatherium of the post-Pliocene period, of the outer crust, whose fossilized skeleton has been found in South America. But the grotesque inhabitants of this forest, I urged, surely they have no counterpart in Earth's history. Who can tell, he rejoined. They may constitute the link between ape and man, all traces of which have been swallowed by the countless convulsions which have racked the outer crust. Or they may be merely the result of evolution along slightly different lines. Either is quite possible. Further speculation was interrupted by the appearance of several of our captors before the entrance of the hut. Two of them entered and dragged us forth. The perilous pathways and the surrounding trees were filled with the black ape men, their females, and their young. There was not an ornament, a weapon, or a garment among the lot. Quite low in the scale of creation, commented Perry. Quite high enough to play the deuce with us, though, I replied. Now what do you suppose they intend doing with us? We were not long in learning. As on the occasion of our trip to the village, we were seized by a couple of the powerful creatures and whirled away through the treetops, while about us and in our wake raced a chattering, jabbering, grinning horde of sleek black ape things. Twice my bearers missed their footing, and my heart ceased beating as we plunged toward instant death among the tangled deadwood beneath. But on both occasions, those lithe, powerful tails reached out and found sustaining branches, nor did either of the creatures loosen their grasp upon me. In fact, it seemed that the incidents were of no greater moment to them than would be the stubbing of one's toe at a street crossing in the outer world. They but laughed uproariously and sped on with me. For some time they continued through the forest. How long I could not guess for, I was learning. What was later borne very forcefully to my mind, that time ceases to be a factor the moment means for measuring it ceased to exist. Our watches were gone, and we were living beneath a stationary sun. Already I was puzzled to compute the period of time which had elapsed since we broke through the crust of the inner world. It might be hours, or it might be days. Who in the world could tell where it was always noon? By the sun, no time had elapsed, but my judgment told me that we must have been several hours in this strange world. Presently, the forest terminated, and we came upon a level plain. A short distance before us rose a few low, rocky hills. Toward these our captors urged us, and after a short time led us through a narrow pass into a tiny circular valley. Here they got down to work, and we were soon convinced that if we were not to die to make a Roman holiday, we were to die for some other purpose. The attitude of our captors altered immediately as they entered the natural arena within the rocky hills. Their laughter ceased. Grim ferocity marked their bestial faces. Bared fangs menaced us. We were placed in the center of the amphitheater, and the thousands the 1,000 creatures forming a great ring about us. Then a wolf dog was brought, Hyenodon, Perry called it, and turned loose with us inside the circle. The thing's body was as large as that of a full-grown mastiff. Its legs were short and powerful, and its jaws broad and strong. Dark, shaggy hair covered its back and sides, while its breast and belly were quite white. As it slunk toward us, it presented a most formidable aspect, with its upcurled lips baring its mighty fangs. Perry was on his knees praying. I stooped and picked up a small stone. At my movement, the beast veered off a bit and commenced circling us. Evidently, it had been a target for stones before. The ape things were dancing up and down, urging the brute on with savage cries, until at last, seeing that I did not throw, he charged us. At Andover and later at Yale, I had pitched on winning ball teams. My speed and control must both have been above the ordinary, for I made such a record during my senior year at college that overtures were made to me in behalf of one of the great major league teams. But in the tightest pitch that ever had confronted me in the past, I had never been in such need for control as now. As I wound up for the delivery, I held my nerves and muscles under absolute command, though the grinning jaws were hurtling toward me at terrific speed. And then I let go, with every ounce of my weight and muscle and science in back of that throw. The stone caught the hyenodon full upon the end of the nose and sent him bowling over upon his back. At the same instant, a chorus of shrieks and howls arose from the circle of spectators, so that for a moment I thought that the upsetting of their champion was the cause. But in this I soon saw that I was mistaken. As I looked, the ape things broke in all directions toward the surrounding hills, and then I distinguished the real cause of their perturbation. Behind them, streaming through the pass which leads into the valley, came a swarm of hairy men, gorilla-like creatures armed with spears and hatchets, bearing long oval shields. Like demons, they set upon the ape things, and before them the hyenodon, which had now regained its senses and its feet, fled howling with fright. Past us swept the pursued and the pursuers, nor did the hairy ones accord us more than a passing glance until the arena had been emptied of its former occupants. Then they returned to us, and one who seemed to have authority among them directed that we be brought with them. When we had passed out of the amphitheater onto the great plain, we saw a caravan of men and women, human beings like ourselves, and for the first time hope and relief filled my heart, until I could have cried out in the exuberance of my happiness. It is true that they were a half-naked, wild-appearing aggregation, but they at least were fashioned along the same lines as ourselves. There was nothing grotesque or horrible about them, as about the other creatures in this strange, weird world. But as we came closer, our hearts sank once more, for we discovered that the poor wretches were chained neck to neck in a long line, and that the gorilla men were their guards. With little ceremony, Perry and I were chained at the end of the line, and without further ado, the interrupted march was resumed. Up to this time, the excitement had kept us both up, but now the tiresome monotony of the long march across the sun-baked plain brought on all the agonies consequent to a long denied sleep. On and on we stumbled beneath the hateful noonday sun. If we fell, we were prodded with a sharp point. Our companions in chains did not stumble. They strode along proudly erect. Occasionally they would exchange words with one another in a monosyllabic language. They were a noble-appearing race, with well-formed heads and perfect physiques. The men were heavily bearded, tall and muscular, the women smaller and more gracefully molded, with great masses of raven hair caught into the loose knots upon their head. The features of both sexes were well proportioned. There was not a face among them that would have been called even plain if judged by earthly standards. They wore no ornaments, but this I later learned was due to the fact that their captors had stripped them of everything of value. As garmenture, the women possessed a single robe of some light-colored spotted hide, rather similar in appearance to a leopard's skin. This they wore either supported entirely about the waist by a leathern thong so that it hung partially below the knee on one side, or possibly loped gracefully across one shoulder. Their feet were shod with skin sandals. The men wore loincloths of the hide of some shaggy beast, long ends of which depended before and behind nearly to the ground. In some instances, these ends were finished with the strong talons of the beast from which the hides had been taken. Our guards, whom I already have described as gorilla-like men, were rather lighter in build than a gorilla, but even so, they were indeed mighty creatures. Their arms and legs were proportioned more in conformity with human standards, but their entire bodies were covered with shaggy brown hair, and their faces were quite as brutal as those of the few stuffed specimens of the gorilla which I had seen in the museums at home. Their only redeeming feature lay in the development of the head above and back of the ears. In this respect, they were not one whit less human than we. They were clothed in a sort of tunic of light cloth which reached to the knees. Beneath this, they wore only a loincloth of the same material, while their feet were shod with thick hide of some mammoth creature of this inner world. Their arms and necks were encircled by many ornaments of metal, silver predominating, and on their tunics were sewn the heads of tiny reptiles in odd and rather artistic designs. They talked among themselves as they marched along on either side of us, but in a language which I perceived differed from that employed by our fellow prisoners. When they addressed the latter, they used what appeared to be a third language, and which I later learned is a mongrel tongue rather analogous to the pidgin English of the Chinese coolie. How far we marched I have no conception, nor has Perry. Both of us were asleep much of the time, for hours before a halt was called, that we dropped in our tracks. For I say for hours, but how may one measure time where time does not exist? When our march commenced, the sun stood at zenith. When we halted, our shadows still pointed toward nadir. Whether an instant or an eternity of earthly time elapsed, who may say? That march may have occupied 9 years and 11 months of the 10 years that I spent in the inner world, or it may have been accomplished in the fraction of a second. I cannot tell, but this I do know, that since you have told me that 10 years have elapsed since I departed from this earth, I have lost all respect for time. I am commencing to doubt that such a thing exists other than in the weak, finite mind of a man. Chapter 4. Grab a quick drink here. Diane the Beautiful. Let's see, Diane, because I don't want to call it Diane because there's no E at the end. I don't know. That's what I'm going with. When our guards aroused us from sleep, we were much refreshed. They gave us food. Strips of dried meat it was, but it put new life and strength into us, so that now we too marched with held heads and took noble strides. At least I did, for I was young and proud. But poor Perry hated walking. On earth, I had often seen him call a cab to travel a square. He was paying for it now, and his old legs wobbled so that I put an arm about him and half carried him through the balance of those frightful marches. The country began to change at last, and we wound up out of the level plain through mighty mountains of virgin granite. The tropical verdure of the lowlands was replaced by hardier vegetation, but even here the effects of constant heat and light were apparent in the immensity of the trees and the profusion of foliage and blooms. Crystal streams roared through their rocky channels, fed by the perpetual snows which we could see far above us. Above the snow-capped heights hung masses of heavy clouds. It was these, Perry explained, which evidently served the double purpose of replenishing the melting snows and protecting them from the direct rays of the sun. By this time we had picked up a smattering of the bastard language in which our guards addressed us, as well as making good headway in the rather charming tongue of our co-captives. Directly ahead of me in the chain gang was a young woman. 3 feet of chain linked us together in a forced companionship, which I, at least, soon rejoiced in, for I found her a willing teacher, and from her I learned the language of her tribe and much of the life and customs of the inner world, at least a part of it with which she was familiar. She told me that she was called Diane the Beautiful, and that she belonged to the tribe of Amos, which dwells in the cliffs above the Darel Az, or the shallow sea. How came you here? I asked her. I was running away from Jubal the Ugly One, she answered, as though that was explanation quite sufficient. Who is Jubal the Ugly One? I asked. And why did you run away from him? She looked at me in surprise. Why does a woman run away from a man? She answered my question with another. They do not where I come from, I replied. Sometimes they run after them. But she could not understand, nor could I get her to grasp the fact that I was of another world. She was quite as positive that creation was originated solely to produce her own kind in the world she lived in, as are many of the outer world. But Jubal, I insisted, tell me about him, and why he ran away to be chained by the neck and scourged across the face of a world. Jubal the Ugly One placed his trophy before my father's house. It was the head of a mighty Tandor. It remained there, and no greater trophy was placed beside it. So I knew that Jubal the Ugly One would come and take me as his mate. None other so powerful wished me, or they would have slain a mightier beast, and thus have won me from Jubal. My father is not a mighty hunter. Once he was, but a Sadok tossed him, and never again had he the full use of his right arm. My brother, Dacor the Strong One, had gone to the land of Sari to steal a mate for himself. Thus, there was none, father, brother, or lover, to save me from Jubal the Ugly One, and I ran away and hid among the hills that skirt the land of Amos. And there the Sagoths found me and made me captive. What will they do with you now? I asked. Where are they taking us? Again, she looked with incredulity. I can almost believe that you are of another world, she said, for otherwise such ignorance were inexplicable. Do you really mean that you do not know that the Sagoths are the creature of the Mahaj? That the mighty Mahars who think that their own Pellicidar, and all that walks or grows upon its surface, or creeps or burrows beneath, or swims within its lakes and oceans, or flies through its air? Next you will be telling me that you never before heard of the Mahars. I was loath to do it, and further incur her scorn, but there was no alternative if I were to absorb knowledge. So I made a clean breast of my pitiful ignorance as to the mighty Mahars. She was shocked, but she did her very best to enlighten me. Though much that she said was as Greek would have been to her, she described the Mahars largely by comparisons. In this way they were like unto Thipdars, in that to the hairless Lidi. About all I gleaned of them was that they were quite hideous, had wings and webbed feet, lived in cities built beneath the ground, could swim underwater for great distances, and were very, very wise. The Sagoths were their weapons of offense and defense, and the races, like herself, were their hands and feet. They were the slaves and servants who did all the manual labor. The Mahars were the heads, the brains of the inner world. I longed to see this wondrous race of supermen. Perry learned the language with me. When we halted, as we occasionally did, though sometimes the halt seemed ages apart, he would join in the conversation, as would Gak, the hairy one. He who was chained just ahead of Dian the Beautiful, ahead of Gak, was Huja, the sly one. He too entered the conversation occasionally. Most of his remarks were directed toward Dian the Beautiful. It didn't take half an eye to see that he had developed a bad case, but the girl appeared totally oblivious to his thinly veiled advances. Did I say thinly veiled? There is a race of men in New Zealand or Australia, I have forgotten which, who indicate their preference for the lady of their affections by banging her over the head with a bludgeon. By comparison with his method, Huja's lovemaking might be called thinly veiled. At first, it caused me to blush violently, although I have seen several old years out at Rector's, and in other less fashionable places off Broadway and in Vienna and Hamburg. But the girl, she was magnificent. It was easy to see that she considers herself as entirely above and apart from her present surroundings and company. She talked with me and with Perry and with the taciturn Gak because we were respectful, but she couldn't even see Huja, the sly one, much less hear him, and that made him furious. He tried to get one of the Sagoths to move the girl up ahead of him in the slave gang, but the fellow only poked him with his spear and told him that he had selected the girl for his own property, that he would buy her from the Mahars as soon as they reached Fudra. Putra, it seemed, was the city of our destination. After passing over the first chain of mountains, we skirted a salt sea, upon whose bosom swam countless horrid things. Seal-like creatures there were, with long necks stretching 10 and more feet above their enormous bodies, and whose snake heads were split with gaping mouths bristling with countless fangs. There were huge tortoises, too, paddling about among these other reptiles, which Perry said were plesiosaurs of the Lias. I didn't question his veracity. They might have been most anything. Deanne told me they were tandurazas, or tandors of the sea, and that the other and more fearsome reptiles, which occasionally rose from the deep to do battle with them, were asdiraths, or sea deeriths. Perry called them ichthyosaurs. They resembled a whale with the head of an alligator. I had forgotten what little geology I had studied at school. About all that remained was an impression of horror that the illustrations of restored prehistoric monsters had made upon me, and a well-defined belief that any man with a pig's shank and a vivid imagination could restore most any sort of Paleolithic monster he saw fit, and take rank at a first-class paleontologist. But when I saw these sleek, shiny carcasses shimmering in the sunlight as they emerged from the ocean, shaking their giant heads, when I saw the waters roll from their sinuous bodies in miniature waterfalls as they glided hither and thither, now upon the surface, now half submerged, as I saw them meet open-mouthed, hissing and snorting in their titanic and interminable warring, I realized how futile is man's poor, weak imagination by comparison with nature's incredible genius. And Perry, he was absolutely flabbergasted. He said so himself. "David," he remarked after we had marched for a long time beside that awful sea. "David, I used to teach geology, and I thought that I believed what I was taught. But now I see that I did not believe it, that it is impossible for man to believe such things as these unless he sees them with his own eyes. We take things for granted, perhaps because we are told them over and over again, and have no way of disproving them, like religions, for example. But we don't believe them, we only think we do. If you ever get back to the outer world, you will find that the geologist and paleontologist will be the first to set you down a liar, for they know that no such creatures as they restore ever existed. It is all right to imagine them as existing in an equally imaginary epoch, but now, proof. Oh, poof. At the next halt, Hooja the Sly, one managed to find enough slack chain to permit him to worm himself back quite close to Dean. We were all standing, and as he edged near the girl, she turned her back upon him in such a truly earthly feminine manner that I could scarce repress a smile. But it was a short-lived smile, for on the instant the sly one's hand fell upon the girl's bare arm, jerking her roughly toward him. I was not then familiar with the customs or social ethics which prevailed in Pellucidar. But even so, I did not need the appealing look which the girl shot me from her magnificent eyes to influence my subsequent act. What the sly one's intention was, I paused not to inquire. But instead, before he could lay hold of her with his other hand, I placed a right to the point of his jaw and felled him in his tracks. A roar of approval went up from those of the other prisoners and the Sagoths who had witnessed the brief drama. Not, as I later learned, because I had championed the girl, but for the neat and, to them, astounding method by which I had bested Hooja. And the girl? First she looked at me with wide, wondering eyes, and then she dropped her head, her face half averted, and a delicate flush suffused her cheek. For a moment she stood thus in silence, and then her head went high, and she turned her back upon me as she had upon Hooja. Some of the prisoners laughed, and I saw the face of Gak, the hairy one, go very black as he looked at me searchingly. And what I could see of Dean's cheek went suddenly from red to white. Immediately after we resumed the march, and though I had realized that in some way I had offended Dean the Beautiful, I could not prevail upon her to talk with me that I might learn wherein I had erred. In fact, I might quite as well have been addressing a sphinx for all the attention I got. At last, my own foolish pride stepped in, and I prevented my making any further attempts, and thus a companionship that, without my realizing it, had come to mean a great deal to me was cut off. Thereafter, I confined my conversation to Perry. Hooja did not renew his advances toward the girl, nor did he again venture near me. Again, the weary and apparently interminable marching became a perfect nightmare of horrors to me. The more firmly fixed became the realization that the girl's friendship had meant so much to me. The more I came to miss it, and the more impregnable the barrier of silly pride. But I was very young and would not ask Gak for the explanation, which I was sure he could give, and that might have made everything all right again. On the march, or during halts, Dean refused consistently to notice me. When her eyes wandered in my direction, she looked either over my head or directly through me. At last, I became desperate and determined to swallow my self-esteem, and again beg her to tell me how I had offended, and how I might make reparation. I made up my mind that I should do this at the next halt. We were approaching another range of mountains at the time, and when we reached them, instead of winding across them through some high-flung pass, we entered a mighty natural tunnel, a series of labyrinthine grottos, dark as Erebus. The guards had no torches or light of any description. In fact, we had seen no artificial light or sign of fire since we had entered Pellucidar. In a land of perpetual noon, there is no need of light above ground. Yet I marveled that they had no means of lighting their way through these dark subterranean passages. So we crept along at a snail's pace, with much stumbling and falling, the guards keeping up a sing-song chant ahead of us, interspersed with certain high notes, which I found always indicated rough places and turns. Halts were now more frequent, but I did not wish to speak to Dean until I could see from the expression of her face how she was receiving my apologies. At last, a faint glow ahead forewarned us of the end of the tunnel, for which I, for one, was devoutly thankful. Then, at a sudden turn, we emerged into the full light of the noonday sun. But with it came a sudden realization of what meant to me a real catastrophe. Dean was gone, and with her half a dozen other prisoners. The guards saw it too, and the ferocity of their rage was terrible to behold. Their awesome, bestial faces were contorted in the most diabolical expressions, as they accused each other of responsibility for the loss. Finally, they fell upon us, beating us with their spear shafts and hatchets. They had already killed too near the head of the line, and were like to have finished the balance of us, when their leader finally put a stop to the brutal slaughter. Never in all my life had I witnessed a more horrible exhibition of bestial rage. I thanked God that Dean had not been one of those left to endure it. Of the 12 prisoners who had been chained ahead of me, each alternate one had been freed, commencing with Dean. Hooja was gone. Gak remained. What could it mean? How had it been accomplished? The commander of the guards was investigating. Soon he discovered that the rude locks which held the neckbands in place had been deftly picked. Hooja the sly one, murmured Gak, who was now next to me in line. He has taken the girl that you would not have, he continued, glancing at me. That I would not have? I cried. What do you mean? He looked at me closely for a moment. I have doubted your story that you are from another world, he said at last, but yet upon no other grounds could your ignorance of the ways of Pellucidar be explained. Do you really mean that you do not know that you offended the beautiful one? And how? I do not know, Gak, I replied. Then shall I tell you? When a man of Pellucidar intervenes between another man and the woman, the other man would have. The woman belongs to the victor. Dean the Beautiful belongs to you. You should have claimed her or released her. Had you taken her hand, it would have indicated your desire to make her your mate. And had you raised her hand above her head and then dropped it, it would have meant that you did not wish her for a mate and that you had released her from all obligation to you. By doing neither, you have put upon her the greatest affront that a man may put upon a woman. Now she is your slave. No man will take her as a mate, or may take her honorably until he shall have overcome you in combat. And men do not choose slave women as their mates, at least not the men of Pellucidar. I did not know that. I did not know, Gak, I cried. I did not know. Not for all of Pellucidar would I have harmed Dean the Beautiful by word, or look, or act of mine. I do not want her as my slave. I do not want her as my... But here I stopped. The vision of that sweet and innocent face floated before me amidst the soft mists of imagination, and where I had on the second believed that I had clung only to the memory of a gentle friendship I had lost, yet now it seemed that I would would have been disloyalty to her to have said that I did not want Dian the Beautiful as my mate. I had not thought of her except as a welcome friend in a strange, cruel world. Even now, I did not think that I loved her. I believe Gak must have read the truth more in my expression than in my words, for presently he laid his hand upon my shoulder. "Man of another world," he said, "I believe you. Lips may lie, but when your heart speaks through the eyes, it tells only the truth. Your heart has spoken to me. I know now that you meant no affront to Dian the Beautiful. She is not of my tribe, but her mother is my sister. She does not know it. Her mother was stolen by Dian's father, who came with many others of the tribe of Amos to battle with us for women, the most beautiful women of Pellucidar. Then was her father king of Amos, and her mother was daughter of the king of Sari, to whose power I, his son, have succeeded. Dian is the daughter of kings. Though her father is no longer king since the Sadok tossed him, and Jubal the Ugly One wrested his kingship from him. Because of her lineage, the wrong you did her was greatly magnified in the eyes of all who saw it. She will never forgive you." I asked Gak if there was not some way in which I could release the girl from the bondage and ignominy I had unwittingly placed upon her. "If ever you find her, yes," he answered. "Merely to raise her hand above her head and drop it in the presence of others is sufficient to release her. But how you may ever find her, you are doomed. But how may you ever find her, you who are doomed to a life of slavery yourself in the buried city of Futra?" "Is there no escape?" I asked. "Huja the Sly One escaped and took the others with him," replied Gak. "But there are no more dark places on the way to Futra. And once there, it is not so easy. The Mahas are very wise. If one escaped from Futra, there are the Thipdars. They would find you." And then the hairy one shuddered. "No one will never escape the mad Mahars." It was a cheerful prospect. I asked Perry what he thought about it, but he only shrugged his shoulders and continued a long-winded prayer he had been at for some time. He was wont to say that the only redeeming feature of our captivity was the ample time it gave him for the improvisation of prayers. It was becoming an obsession with him. The Sagoths had begun to take notice of his habit of declaiming throughout entire marches. One of them asked him what he was saying, to whom he was talking. The question gave me an idea, so I answered quickly before Perry could say anything. "Do not interrupt him," I said. "He is a very holy man in the world from which we come. He is speaking to spirits which you cannot see. Do not interrupt him, or they will spring out of the air upon you and rend you limb from limb." Like that, and I jumped toward the great brute with a loud boo that sent him stumbling backward. I took a long chance, I realized, but if we could make any capital out of Perry's harmless mania, I wanted to make it while the making was prime. It worked splendidly. The Sagoths treated us both with marked respect during the balance of the journey, and then passed the word along to their masters, the Mahars. 2 marches after this episode, we came to the city of Futra. The entrance to it was marked by 2 lofty towers of granite, which guarded a flight of steps leading to the buried city. Sagoths were on guard here, as well as at 100 more other towers scattered about over a large plain. And that's the end of chapter 4. And I'm going to take my first break. I'm going to cut it off here. So for those of you who listen to this as the podcast version of this, it will all be put together as one piece. I won't put it, up as parts. I'll just put it up as one piece of audio. So we'll just continue on, just so you know. And I'll pick this back up in a little bit, possibly. I'll see where I'm at in a little bit, and maybe pop on and read a little more. I just finished chapter 4, and we're on chapter 5, which is titled Slaves. So I'll be back in a little bit, and we'll plug away at that. Until then.